Chapter 15. The Jester. The 2 days that followed Jim's request for Sarah were uncomfortable, even for people being held in slavery by a maniacal madman. Sarah was racked with guilt over getting out of the dangerous delivery duty. She didn't say so, but it was blindingly clear. Jim refused to let himself feel guilty. For better or worse, this was Rick's stupid plan, and what happened was entirely his responsibility. But the shame still danced around the periphery of Jim's mind. Rick was putting himself out there to find a path towards freedom, and Jim could offer nothing. In fact, all of his efforts were making the gang stronger. Communication between the three brains and their teenage counterpart were slow but possible. AZ didn't want them hooked together unless it was necessary. In addition, Rick spent a lot of time with Nate in the garage. Sarah and Jim's cases were always together on the table of the small room AZ held them in. They could always speak to each other through the speakers on each case, but they had to be careful about what they said. Covertly, though, all three used their virtual cell phones to send each other unfiltered messages. This was easiest for Jim and Nate, as they always had keyboards on hand, but Sarah and Rick were able to send short responses whenever they slipped out of view of the virtual cameras in each of their respective simulations. It was difficult to tell how much AZ was spying on the trio. He let on little what few times they spoke, but it was clear he was watching. If Nate happened to say, accidentally, leave Jim and Sarah's encasements facing away from the camera they knew about in the room, and then leave the room to use the bathroom. No, not that bathroom. God, no. Somebody like Diane would slip in and reposition the tanks back to face the hidden camera before he returned. Perhaps one of the other goons was in charge of watching them. It wasn't like AZ wasn't busy with other things. The gang was doing very well. Jim's efforts to straighten out their income had made the gang very profitable. Jim never thought it possible to have commerce without actual money, but he surprised himself by making it work so very well. Without credits, people had a hard time keeping track of the value of things, and a clever person could really take advantage of that. It was like Jim was a shark in a pool full of minnows. As much as it amused him to dominate the market with his decades of practical experience, it was a faint distraction from his real problems. Worse yet, it was a distraction that aided his enemies and failed to get any of his real friends out of harm's way. In the face of Rick's brave and yet stupid plan, Jim's work to keep them safe and useful to the gang felt like a betrayal. It was the best plan, logically he knew it, but he still hated himself for it. The morning before Rick's maiden voyage as a suicide delivery man, Jim was poking away at his ancient computer, in the cell of an even far more ancient castle dungeon. Watching him closely behind the bars in front of him, Jim could swear Charlie the Shark Man was staring at him disapprovingly. Finally, Jim broke down and said, "Shut up! I know what I'm doing!" The Shark Man growled back in its absurd Spanish conquistador outfit. Even the growl sounded disapproving. "What do you know, stupid shark?" said Jim. The speaker on Jim's case echoed in the real world. While they couldn't see Sarah's case or its screen, they could hear each other just fine. "I'm worried too, Jim," said Sarah from somewhere in the room. Her voice came through Jim's view screen, even if her image did not. Just hearing her voice, Jim immediately felt the enormous pressure of the world lift off his shoulders ever so slightly. Reactive to his emotions, the shark man grunted and returned to his pacing. "Did you say shark?" asked Sarah. "It's Charlie the Shark. He started out as just a fish in the first simulation Nate got me into, and AZ warped him into a walking shark man thing. In every simulation, he's like my jailer. He's always there," said Jim. "Oh God, that must be terrible. Does he ever go away? How do you sleep?" asked Sarah. "It's fine. At least he doesn't attack the bars in my cage anymore. At this point, I hardly notice him," said Jim. That was a white lie. Of course he noticed him. How do you ever stop noticing a circling shark? "If it makes you feel better, my room is a spooky house with paintings on the walls that are always watching me." "Really? Like a haunted house thing?" said Jim. As their cases were almost always parallel to each other, neither of them could see the display on the front of each other's cases. Both Sarah and himself only had the camera views of the couch in front of the table and the rusted steel wall behind it. The cabin they were in was much like the first cabin AZ stored Jim in, although thankfully this room had yet to be covered in blood. "Yeah, the floorboards creak. There's a stormy sky outside with bats flying around. It's all very cheesy," said Sarah with a little laugh. She paused for a second, and Jim guessed that at that moment she remembered that AZ was likely listening in. "But it's all very tasteful. It's got a solid theme going on." Jim couldn't help but to laugh a little. He was so sick of that self-important sycophant. If AZ was listening in, he couldn't get mad at Jim without revealing that he was spying on them. If Jim was going to be a court jester, why not push the king's buttons a little? Jim stood up and paced in front of his desk. "I don't know. I think it could have been done better. I think my room is sort of the thing an amateur would do. A jester in a medieval prison? So passé. Sarah didn't say anything for a moment, and then a little private text popped up on Jim's screen that said, question mark, question mark, question mark. Jim smiled and continued, and why a Spanish theme? This is clearly an English castle, and yet Charlie's dressed up like a conquistador. And what part of any of this should have an old-timey computer? Randomness is not originality. It's all just so poorly done, clearly pieced together by a child. Is the work getting to you? Maybe you need a break, said Sarah cautiously. Nah, you know what? I'm feeling great. I really need to get that off my chest. Thank goodness AZ isn't here to listen to any of this. Can you imagine if he was spying on us right now? I bet that would really piss him off. He seems like the kind of guy that can't handle a little constructive criticism. I bet he'd fly off the handle like a child at even the suggestion that he was untalented. This put a big smile on Jim's face. For AC to get his revenge, he'd have to admit he'd been spying on them. His only other option was to take a big old bite of that sandwich and pretend he didn't hear a thing. This wasn't a brilliant thing to do, Jim knew it, but just the thought of ticking off their would-be king without him being able to do a single thing was just too tempting. Isn't ticking off the king part of a court jester's job? Jim stretched and cracked his knuckles. For such an awful room, he was surprised that it had the code support to do something as minor as properly cracking someone's knuckles. Even if an amateur psycho designed this room, the back-end code making it work was superb. Oh well, time to get back to work. Making this gang rich, said Jim. After a few minutes, a text message appeared from Sarah asking, what dat ness? It was her shorthand for, was that necessary? Jim waited a few minutes before texting back a message. No, but it felt great. Let's see what he does. Either he tips his hand that he's spying on us, or I just ruined his day and there's nothing he can do about it. One long pause later, Sarah's reply came back on Jim's screen. You're playing with fire. Jim really was, and yet he didn't care. He needed this one tiny, small victory. Better yet, it could yield some important information about their adversary. Was AC dumb enough to take the bait? Jim could be locked up in a tiny tiger's cage in a Vietnam War prison camp by tomorrow, but only if AZ was dumb enough to reveal he was spying on them. Or he could come down and stomp Jim into a coma, but only if his temper was wildly bigger than his intelligence. This was a good test of AZ's limits. Then a nagging voice in Jim's head reminded him that if AZ really wanted to hurt Jim, he wouldn't need to lay a hand on him directly. Jim's real Achilles heel was his friends. Damn it! Where was this nagging voice when Jim came up with this stupid plan?